Hey, thanks for joining us online. We're back in our study of Romans. You know, when I was 10 years old, I went out for Little League football. And some friends told me, you'll love those coaches on the junior varsity level. They said, oh, Mr. Trupp and Mr. Comig and they're great. Well, that first week, we went through conditioning. And here was the drill. They'd give us 30 seconds to line up, and if we didn't get our line straight, they'd make us run, and we'd come back and line up again. And we'd do a set of exercises, and if we didn't all finish together, they'd make us run again. And I'm thinking, what's great about these coaches? Well, later in the season, I found out what was great. They were building discipline, and they were building conditioning, and we had a really good team. And it was really a lot of fun playing for them. Well, in a similar way, we hear the word that God is faithful, and we think, great, He's faithful. But then we come to understand that part of His faithfulness is He will judge us, and we think, I don't get that. Just like when we were running and going through this discipline, we think, how can a faithful God judge us? Well, that's what I want to talk about this morning. So if you got a Bible, if you'd open it to Romans chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 1 and go all the way through verse 20, asking this question, how can a faithful God judge us? So let's get a quick snapshot of what's going on in Romans. Paul's written this letter to these people he's never met. And at the front of the letter, he puts this thesis. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of salvation to the Jew first and then to the Greek. And then he begins to build a case why he's not ashamed of the gospel. And he starts with the Gentiles, the people who've never heard special revelation from God. He said, they're still guilty because God has shown Himself in the creation. And then he turned his focus to the Jew, the religious person who had special revelation from God. And he said, your status doesn't mean you'll escape the judgment of God. And in fact, at the end of chapter 2, he went through two of their religious badges of honor. The scriptures and circumcision. He said, you count on these things and they won't win you favor with God. And so that's where we pick up. And the question that's lingering is, well, if those things don't matter, what advantage is there to being Jewish? And that's what Paul starts with in verse 3. He says, here's our question, then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? Well, he answers his question starting in verse 2. Great in every respect. And he starts a list. First of all, they were entrusted with the oracles of God. God chose to reveal Himself, and this people, the Jewish people, He picked it out to give them to. And Paul's going to continue his list when he gets sidetracked. And he never comes back to this list. He starts a different thought. And we get that thought in verse 3. What then, he says, if some, the Jews, did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? So he said, let's think about the Jews, because some of them, man, they haven't believed, they haven't embraced God. And God went into a covenant, He went into a contract with them. Well, their lack of belief won't nullify God's faithfulness. There's a word. See, if we make a contract and you and I agree on something and you say you'll do this and I'll pay you that, but you don't do it, then I'm free from my obligation. I don't have to pay you anything because you didn't hold up your end of the contract. And Paul's saying, is that the way God works? We don't hold up our end of the contract and God says, I'm done. No, that's not the way God works. He answers that question in verse 4. May it never be, he says. Rather, let God be found true, faithful to Himself, though every man be found a liar. Hey, if every person breaks the covenant, God's going to be found true. As it is written, and he quotes from Psalm 51. This is a psalm David wrote when he was being judged for the sin of adultery and murder. Here's what David wrote. That you may be justified in your words of judgment, and prevail when you are judged. So Paul's going right to the heart of the issue. How can a faithful God judge His people? And so he takes on these arguments starting in verse 5. He says, speaking of the Jewish person, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That's what you just said in verse 4. God, you will show yourself righteous even when you judge. So the Jewish person says, hey, if we're unrighteous and God's going to show his righteousness through it, why are we judged? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? How can God, who shows his unrighteousness, who shows his righteousness when we're wrong, how can he judge us for being wrong? Paul says, I'm speaking in human terms. Paul answers the question, may it never be. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? So we want to argue, hey, I did wrong, but God shows himself right, so it's not right for God to judge me. Paul says that's ridiculous. If that's your argument, then there's no way that God will judge the world. A similar argument in verse 7. But if through my lie, the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? Okay, so I lie, but God shows himself to be true through my lie. Why am I being judged? Paul answers that in verse 8. And why not say, as we slanderously reported, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil, that good may come. And so the idea is, hey, if God's going to show himself true and he's going to show himself righteous through my evil, I guess I should just do evil all the time because God will show himself true and righteous. And Paul says that's ridiculous. His conclusion then is their condemnation is just. Jewish person's trying to get off for doing wrong because God shows himself to be true. So let me see if I can bring it home this way. Several years ago, a teacher for Lincoln Public Schools was upset with a superior. And this teacher was in the district office. And so she threw a lit piece of paper on the superior's desk. Well, that set the whole district office on fire, and the thing was burned to the ground. That person was tried and found guilty of arson. Well, that was a major setback for Lincoln Public Schools, but they were shrewd. They collected insurance money. They built a newer, more efficient building. They were able to sell some of the land for profit, and they brought good out of that evil situation. Nobody would say, well, that Lincoln Public Schools brought good out of it. They ought to let this person out of prison because good came through their bad. No, we wouldn't say that. That's Paul's argument here. You Jewish people say, well, God's showing himself good in our sin. Why doesn't he let us off? God is just, and God is righteous, and that's part of his character. See, when we say God is faithful, we're saying that God is faithful to himself. We want to say God is faithful. That means he looks past. No. God is faithful to his character. He's just, and he's righteous, and he will judge sin. If God stops being that, our world's in trouble. We have no basis for justice. We have no heaven to look forward to that will be completely sin-free. Let me see if I can bring it home this way. Imagine us in Lincoln, Nebraska, are served by a judge who just can't bring himself to hand down a sentence. A person can be convicted of a crime, a murder, an assault, but though it was heinous and though people were hurt, he's just so soft-hearted. He can't do it. What kind of a community are we living in? We're living in fear because no one will execute justice. Imagine you're a police officer or you're in the district attorney's office and you're serving under this kind of judge. Why would you do your job? There's no reason because the judge will not do what he's supposed to do and execute a sentence. We desperately need God to be just and righteous. So we're wrestling with this question, how can a faithful God judge us? God's faithfulness means he must judge us. God's faithfulness means he must judge us. And Paul's bringing this point to light because the Jewish person wants to say, no, not me, because I've got this elevated status, I've got this position. Somehow I get off on God's judgment. Paul's saying, no, that doesn't get you off. You will be held accountable like every other person for their actions. Well, you saying, that's all good and well, and I'm sorry the Jewish person had that problem, but what does that have to do with me? When I worked campus ministry, I had the chance to talk with hundreds, and I would say even into thousands of college students. And when I would talk to them about being a sinner, I said, let's put the Bible aside for a second. Let's just use your own moral code. Do you break your own moral code? And every one of them would say, yeah, I do. So we don't need the Bible to prove that you're guilty of sin. You would admit it. Yeah. Well, what kind of consequence is that for your sin? Is there a God who judges sin? Well, yeah. Well, who does God judge? Well, he judges Hitler, and he judges Stalin, and he judges Genghis Khan, and all those people way down there. And somewhere up here, he draws a line, and I just know I'm somewhere above that line. Well, where exactly is that line? I don't know. I just know I'm above that line. See, we're all guilty of doing what the Jewish person that Paul's pointing out here. We all want to somehow set ourselves, somehow, some way, we get off God's judgment. All those other people, those really bad people, but not me, not us. Paul wants to take that on. And so he does in verse 9. Here's what he says. What then? Are we better than they? No, that's a rhetorical question. Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. We're all under judgment of God. There's no special status that gets us off. Paul then quotes from Psalm 14, 1 through 3 to say, you want to know one of the symptoms? Listen to your words. He'll talk about the lips, the mouth, and the throat. Our words reveal what's in our heart. Here's what he says, as it is written. Verses 10 through 12 talk about the fact that we all push back on God. We all push away from him. Here's what it says from Psalm 14, 1 through 3. There is none righteous, not even one. There's none who understands. There's no one who seeks for God. All have turned aside together. They have become useless. There is no one who does good. There's not even one. Paul's point is no one seeks for God. No one does good. Well, Andy, you say there's philanthropic works all over, but those are driven by a corrupted heart. I do it to assuage my guilt. I do it to feel better about myself. I do it to look good. Paul says, from God's perspective, no one does good. Then, this is what I was talking about, Paul quotes a bunch of Psalms to say, you want evidence for a corrupt heart? It's in our words. And here's what he has to say. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Why is Paul so concerned about our words? Because our words show what's in our heart. We can't control it. It comes out. And maybe it's conversations we have with ourselves, but they indicate that something's very wrong. You know, if you or I were to listen to a recording of what we said or the conversations we had in our mind just from this last week, I think we'd all cringe. We'd all say, something's wrong there. And Paul's saying our words show that we've pushed back on God. We've done our own thing. There's no one who seeks God. There's no one who does good. It's shown in our words. Paul then goes on in verses 15 and 16 and 17 to quote Isaiah 59, 7 and 8. It says, you know what? When we decide to live for self, when we push back on God, the outcome is violence. Listen to what he says in verse 15. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. Look, when there's no God, and all I've got is 60 or 80 years or whatever I have to get what I want, I'm going to take what I can get, and if you get in my way, I'll do what I have to do. If I have to get violent, so be it. You know, if there's a law that keeps me from doing it, then I'll go backward. I'll go around your back. I'll gossip. I'll talk you down. If I can't get violent, maybe I'll be passive aggressive. But the end is, I get aggressive to get what I want. So in verse 18, Paul says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Well, Andy, what do you mean? Our view of God doesn't affect our behavior. We care more about this world or what's being said in this world than we do what God thinks. You see a person who fears God, their view of God affects their actions. So when I was in high school, I was on the swim team. And on the Friday, we'd have a swim meet. We'd all agree to wear a tie. Now, nobody wore a tie to high school. And I know there were people that would see me walk in with my tie and they go, oh, there's the arrogant jock wearing his tie. You know what? I didn't care what they thought. I cared more about what my teammates thought. And if somebody wanted to mock me from wearing a tie, so be it. See, when we have a fear of God, it affects our behavior. I care more about what God thinks than what other people think. It's sort of, Paul's saying, there's no fear. People live for the here and now. God doesn't affect our behavior. So, we get in this situation. We've pushed back on God. It's shown in our words. It's shown in our aggressiveness. And we see this and we think, man, we better do something. We better counteract. So I get a low score on my first test in a class. I better get a high score to counteract that. I don't do well on my first or second shot in the basketball court. I really concentrate that I can make up for it later in the game. And so that's what we want to do with our good works. Paul says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God. He says, because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. No one will be justified by God through doing good works. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Hey, God gave us his word. So we know we're sinners. So we know we need God. He never gave us a word as a means, if you keep this and you do this, you can be right with God. The idea that we can work our way to God is misinformation. It won't get us where we want to go. So as a little guy, and even now, I tend to carry a little bit of weight around my midsection. And so I thought, you know what? I will do a bunch of sit-ups to solve that problem. I'll just exercise this. And finally said, you know, Andy, there's nothing wrong with doing good sit-ups. It strengthens your core, but it's not solving your problem. Your problem is you're eating too much and your body's storing it around your middle. If you really want to take care of your middle, you got to change what you eat. So if we've got these problems with our words and our actions and we think, well, we'll do good works, it's like me doing the sit-ups. It doesn't work. We need a change of heart. And that's where the gospel comes in. Because what we've seen in this passage is there's no elevated status. Nobody gets off. All of us are under condemnation. All of us have our words show that we're guilty. All of us have the tendency to be aggressive. And all of us tend to think, well, maybe if I do enough good works. Paul says that won't work. That won't get us there. Well, Andy, this is kind of a depressing passage. Do you have any good news for me? As a matter of fact, I do. I want us to remember this is in the context of the book of Romans. And Paul started this book with these words. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why, Paul? Why are you so emphatic about this? For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. In the gospel is the remedy for this situation we've just looked at in Romans 3. It's in the gospel. It's not in our actions. It's not in our words. Well, what is it in the gospel? Well, here it is. For it is the righteousness of God. We get right standing with God. For the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. In our faith, we get right standing. As it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. When we put our faith in Christ, God sees us through Jesus. So my first year with Campus Crusade, I was working in Colorado, and I would drive back to Dallas to meet with my donors and try and raise more support. And there I would meet with a lot of college friends. And I had a beater of a car that was about to die. So we went to a dealership in Dallas, and I saw this car that was a year old, and it was a make and a model that was Consumer Reports said was highly reliable. And so I went to talk to the salesman about it and about getting credit, and he came back and he said, your credit score, you just don't have enough credit. We're not going to be able to lend you money. At which point my friend says, I'll co-sign for him. I say, you can't do that. He said, sure I can. At that point, the salesman goes, and he gets another contract, and I'm talking with my friend, and he comes back with a contract, and my friend says, where do I sign? And the guy says, sign right there. And he signs. He said, now, Andy, you need to sign here. All of a sudden, they were willing to lend me money. Why? Because they weren't looking at me through my credit score. They were looking at me through his credit score. And before that, I wasn't worth lending money. But because of him, now I was a good credit risk. Do you understand that before Jesus, our score doesn't match up to God's standards? But in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, and God sees us with Jesus' score, and he's perfect. And all of a sudden, we're restored. What we couldn't do on our own, Jesus does for us. That's why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. For it's the power of salvation to the Jew first, to the religious, and then to the Greek, to the non-religious. For any who would believe. Man, in a time of crisis, that's good news. That's good news. I'm following the news like you are, and I'm seeing this social distancing is working. And there was a time I saw projections of 250,000 deaths in the United States, and now that's down to 60,000. And man, I rejoice about that. That could be a savings of 150 to 200,000 lives, and that's worth celebrating. But I want to remind you of this for those 150 to 200,000 people. It only puts off the inevitable. We're all going to die someday. If COVID-19 doesn't get us, something else will. And the message is, without Jesus, we don't make God's standards. It's in the gospel that we're saved from that judgment. If there's any silver lining in this COVID-19 crisis, it reminds us we're not in control. That has become more clear to me than ever. As a little kid, I didn't love these amusement rides. I just kind of get scared by them. So finally I got talked into one. And we're on one of these cars that it's going to throw you off the track, and it goes here and there. And I'm kind of freaking out. And in the middle, there's this wheel. So as we're going, I'm turning that wheel for all I'm worth. And we finish. And whew. You know what my friend says to me when we get off? Andy, that wheel was for show. That didn't do anything in directing the car. And it made me realize when I get on one of those rides, I'm really relying on the designer. I hope the designer got it right. And the designers of the rides gives us some things we can do. Keep your seatbelt on, don't stand up. And there's some things we can do in this COVID crisis to mitigate some of the stuff. But in the end, we're desperately dependent on the designer. Here's what the designer has told us in life. We need to believe in Jesus to be right with God. We need to believe in Jesus to be connected to the one who is in control. Because he's faithful to his character. And because of that, he is just and he is righteous and he will judge us. About 4 years ago, our family was out in Colorado for vacation. We're up on Mount Evans. It's about, 10 or 11,000. It's above tree line. And all of a sudden, we see a storm coming in. And I say to my wife, Hope, we need to get down. So we worked our way down the mountain. But imagine if a 18-wheeler had jackknifed and there was no way down. And here comes this storm and it's coming. What would we do? We're above tree line. What would we do if we're in that case, if we could find a shelter, a cave that we could go in? We'd still experience the judgment on the mountain, but we'd experience very differently if we were under a shelter than if we were out on the mountain. If we're out on the mountain above the tree line, it'd be a terrifying thing. If we're in shelter, it'd be an amazing thing, it'd be an awesome thing, because we're protected. Do you understand the judgment of God is inevitable? And Paul's saying, I've got a shelter. His name is Jesus, and it will change the way you and I experience the judgment of God. He is faithful, and he will judge us. But he is also gracious and merciful and offers us a place out of the judgment of God. And that place is in Jesus. Would you pray with me? Our Father in heaven, we're grateful for Jesus, who frees us from the judgment of God. Our score doesn't end up. That this passage says that our words show us, our aggressiveness shows us, our works fall short. We'd like to think we have an elevated status, but we don't. Lord, that we take hold of you, especially in this time of uncertainty. Pray in Christ's name. Amen.